Hey there, I'm Mr. Terry, a high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher Reacts video. All right, if you're watching this video very close to when it's been put out, you'll know about the Russia versus Ukraine war. And some developments have kind of gone on, which potentially could see Russia with some civil problems, specifically with the military, the Russian government, and the mercenary groups that are involved in the conflict right now. So I thought right now would be another good chance for us to look at context of Russia and Ukraine. Because a Russian invasion of Ukraine is not a new thing. It has happened before. So I wanted to check out a video by the awesome channel Simple History of one I haven't seen before, and it's just simply called Russia's Invasion of Ukraine. Well, let's see what they got there, and hopefully together we can apply some context to the current conflict. All right, Simple History is awesome. You've probably heard of them, but if you haven't, you've been missing out on one of the biggest animated history YouTube channels out there. The video is going to be linked down below. Make sure you give it a view, a like, and definitely subscribe to them. As always, we appreciate your comments down below. Just make sure they're civil. All right, let's get started. There we go. Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I like their animated style too. If you haven't seen them, I think you'll like it too.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine, 1917 to 1921.
We're starting with the revolution.
In the final
and then
years of the First World War, the Russian Empire was coming to its end. It had been devastated by revolution and finally transformed into the first communist country in the world. In the years following the revolution, non-Russian nations that lived under the House of Romanov sought to secure their long-lost independence. One of these was Ukraine. From 1970.
Yeah, now as many you probably think of the Soviet Union, how big that was. Remember the Russian Empire of similar territory is also very large. So there's been a long history of Ukraine, both under the occupation of, again, the Russian Empire, but also the USSR. So this is a long time coming. Famous
17 until 1921, the Ukrainians struggled to build and secure an independent country, fighting against the new regime, against their neighbors in the West, and amongst themselves. When in February 1917, the revolution had overthrown the monarchy in Russia, and the event had echoed throughout the entire empire.
And executed the family.
In Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, the Central Rada, or the Central Council, had taken over control of the country, which on June 23, 1917, proclaimed the free Ukrainian National Republic without severing its connections with the Russian state.
So you see, with the revolution, it didn't just have to be about like the proletariat class or anything. You could see where these other, places under the jurisdiction of the Russian Empire, didn't necessarily have to be about the ideology of the Russian Revolution, but also use it as a way to gain freedom. Because if one regime's going down, you're hoping you can kind of, ride along with that.
The nation began to awake. However, keeping the vast territory of Ukraine under control was a difficult task, and the country rapidly slid into anarchy. The collapse of the Russian forces in Galicia made matters even worse.
They're going to be split too.
On November 7, 1917, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, staged an armed insurrection in Petrograd, today known as St. Petersburg, and this became the uprising that changed the country for good. 3 days after this, together with the aid from Rada, the Bolsheviks attacked the army staff headquarters in Kyiv, forcing them to leave the city. However, contrary to Lenin's plans, control over Ukraine was quickly taken over by the Central Rada. The Bolsheviks were not...
It was such, like during the revolution and right after, a lot of people think, I think they kind of forget about the Russian Civil War. I mean, seriously. People know way more about the Russian Revolution, the Civil War that follows after. And in a lot of ways, you really got to talk about the revolution doesn't really end until, the White Army is defeated. You got the Red Army versus the White Army. So you have the one that supports the monarchy versus one that supports kind of the Bolsheviks and the communists. And even with that, that's just very surface level. Every time I learn more about the Russian Civil War and Russian Revolution, there are deeper and deeper levels and things that complicate it. And it just, every time I go down further, there's more and more that I find out and how complicated it actually is.
unpopular in Ukraine, having no more than 5,000 party members in the country. Most of their supporters were industrial workers, Russians, and Jews from the Donetsk region. These men were antagonistic to the Ukrainian national movement.
So many different agendas.
Bolsheviks confronted Rada right from the start. On December 17, 1917, after failing to grab control over the All-Ukrainian Congress of Soviets, the Bolsheviks left Kiev for Kharkiv and proclaimed the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Already at that point, the Bolshevik troops from Russia were preparing for the invasion of Ukraine. The war was about to start.
You can see they quickly, under a new regime, the Soviets here and the Soviet Union as it's going to be created, immediately was trying to recapture all the stuff from the Soviet Empire. It's like they weren't going to let those other places go. The communists didn't necessarily come in and say, all right, everyone can decide to do what they want, and make all their own decisions about their autonomy and all this stuff. It's not like that. So for a lot of these people, they just felt like they were replacing one regime for another and, didn't want that. And for them, it was like nothing changes in a lot of ways, at least in the beginning. Okay, things obviously get more drastic later on. You get the Stalin era, the Holodomor, those kind of things. But let's keep going.
The invasion army of 30,000 men entered Ukraine on December 25, 1917.
Christmas.
Led by Vladimir Antonov Ovchinko, it comprised regulars of the Army of Soviet Russia and local Red Guards from eastern Ukraine. In response to the invasion, Central Rada proclaimed an independent Ukrainian state. Ukraine was defended by Free Cossack units, workers' battalions, the Hidemaka battalion, comprising military school students, and the Galatian battalion of Sich riflemen, which was made up of former Austrian prisoners of war.
Remember, we still got World War I weaponry. Remember, World War I was so devastating when it comes to casualties and stuff like that because of the new technologies. A lot of these technologies that are either new or have been extremely improved from, years past. So a lot of people don't know this war, how insanely bloody it was. When you look at per capita and all that stuff, it'll surprise you.
The strength of the Rada's forces was not more than 15,000 men. Ukrainian forces proved inadequate in stopping the invasion. One after another, towns in eastern Ukraine were falling into the hands of the Bolshevik troops. By the end of January, they had occupied Donbass and left Bank Ukraine and were approaching the city of Kyiv itself. The central Rada...
it's like they had already been invaded, right? The whole Russian Empire was invaded by Germany. And then you get the treaty, right? Russia signed away a lot of its land. Over to Germany, and now they're getting invaded again, right? But now by, the Russians themselves, like the former empire, if you want to call it that. A rough go for Ukraine, having this go back and forth. Hey, same thing's going to happen in World War II, invaded by the Germans, then invaded by the Soviets again, all that.
Sent a unit of around 500 volunteers to meet the invasion force. The student battalion of Sich riflemen and a detachment of the Hidemaka battalion faced the enemy in the Battle of Kruti on January 29, 1918. Both sides had armored trains at the seam, but on different tracks. The Bolshevik troops quickly disembarked from their train carriages and started running towards the young Ukrainian soldiers, who jumped into a makeshift trench system and opened fire with their rifles and Maxim machine guns. The Bolshevik wave was...
Okay, once you hear trenches and you hear people charging and you hear Maxim machine gun, add all those things up into bloodbath, which is why World War I especially was so horrible, is a combination of those things.
Driven back, but the inexperienced students thought that they were in a full-blown retreat, so they jumped out of their trenches and began to give chase. At this point, the next wave of Bolsheviks charged out from their train, and vicious hand-to-hand fighting ensued. Plus, the artillery fire from both trains added to the carnage.
That's like old school warfare.
Students were hopelessly outnumbered, and the few that were left alive were taken prisoner. They were shown no mercy, though, as a firing squad was quickly formed up, and about 18 of the young men were executed on the spot. That same day, the Bolsheviks staged an armed rebellion in Kyiv to overthrow the Central Rada.
Bolsheviks were in urban areas all over the, former empire. It was very much an urban movement.
Lasted until February 4th, when government forces defeated the last group of insurgents. The failure of the uprising in Kiev didn't withhold the advance of the Bolshevik army. The Central Rada was forced to evacuate Kiev on February 8th. A day later, the Bolshevik troops entered the city and instigated their reign of terror. Facing total defeat, the Central Rada resorted to requesting foreign assistance.
Just wanted to remind you all, remember what we're doing, trying to do with this video is think of the modern conflict, right? And compare it to these other conflicts between Russia and Ukraine. So right now, be asking yourself, what is similar about the conflicts, and then also what's different, right? Be thinking about that. And as you think about those things, I'd love to see your comments down below, kind of comparing and contrasting the Russian and Ukrainian conflicts. This being one of them.
On the same day that the Bolsheviks entered Kiev, on February 9th, 1918, the Ukrainian National Republic signed the Brest-Litovsk peace treaty with the Central Powers. According to the articles of the treaty, Germany and Austro-Hungary had committed to providing military aid to the Ukrainians in fighting the Bolsheviks in return for them delivering large quantities of foodstuff.
Ukraine is the grain hub of Europe. Their food supply, it's a vast agricultural region, is absolutely necessary, not just to Russia, but to Europe. Like it is important, it's pivotal.
In late February 1918, 450,000 German and Austro-Hungarian soldiers marched into Ukraine and swept away the Bolshevik forces.
Now another invasion.
March 1st, 1918, the Central Rada returned to Kiev. By the end of April, troops of the Central Powers had regained control of the entire Ukraine. The defeat of the Bolshevik troops in Ukraine coerced Lenin to sign the Brest-Litovsk Treaty and recognize the independence of the Ukrainian National Republic.
Question for you guys. Do you think if now, under the leadership of Lenin and the Soviet government, do you still think it was impossible for the Russians to defeat the Germans? Do you think they could have had a chance with new leadership and stuff like that? Overall, I guess what I'm asking you is, do you think Lenin signing the treaty, do you think it was a good thing? Do you think they gave up too much? Did they give up too little? Are they just lucky to even have an option of a treaty? What do you guys think of the alternate reality of that? If under Lenin and the Bolshevik leadership, if they'd continue World War I? Yes, they did fight, they still kept fighting after the revolution and stuff like that. But I mean, like at this point, the time the treaty was signed.
On June 12, 1918, the governments in Moscow and Kiev signed a preliminary
what happens
peace.
if Germany invades in
the peace
World War II?
with Russia brought no stability to Ukraine, though. The Germans overthrew the Central Rada and installed a Hetman government to secure a better foodstuff supply. Until November 1918 and the capitulation of the Central Powers, the Germans were controlling Ukraine. On December 14, 1918, they left Kiev, and a new government came into power, the Directory of the Ukrainian National Republic. On January 22, 1919, the Ukrainian National Republic proclaimed the union with the Western Ukrainian National Republic, the Ukrainian ethnic territory of the former Austria-Hungary. Formerly one country, the Ukrainian National Republic and the Western Ukrainian National Republic were actually two separate states with their own governments and armies. After the Germans withdrew, Ukraine fell into a state of complete anarchy. 6 different armies operated in the territory during 1919. The Army of the Ukrainian National Republic, the Ukrainian Galatian Army, Soviet Russia's Red Army, a Russian anti-communist coalition, the White Army, Polish troops, the Entente troops, and the anarchist units. Taking advantage of the chaotic situation in the country, Moscow launched a new offensive against Ukraine in December 1918. Kiev responded with a declaration of war on the Russian Soviet Republic. The Ukrainians were entirely unprepared for the war, though. Their army of 25,000 men consisted of 2 main units, the Sich Riflemen and the Zaporozhian Corps, along with a number of partisan units under the command of politically unreliable otamans.
They're no better than they were the first time.
Against them was the Expeditionary Force, composed of Red Army regular units and local irregulars.
It kind of seems like, with this, how they're talking about it, it's like the longer this goes on, the worse it's going to be for Ukraine. And one of the questions I often ask students when we study wars is this question. Of the sides, who benefits more from it being a longer war, and who benefits more from it being, you know, a short war? Like one of the things that we use to analyze it is like the American Revolution. The longer the war goes on for like the American Revolution, the better it is for the Americans, like for the Americans, right? War is expensive, of course, but you know, wars become unpopular, and that was a big deal, you know, with the revolution and Britain's kind of lack of ambition for it and losing support in Parliament and all that stuff. So, what do you think about in this conflict right here, both this one and the current conflict? Actually, let's focus on the current conflict, okay, based off of what we know about other conflicts. The longer this goes on, who do you think benefits more, the Ukrainians or the Russians? What do you think and why? Put down below.
They too had around 25,000 men under arms, but their strength rose progressively with many partisan units joining their side. Under the command of Vladimir Antonov Ovchinko, the Red Army advanced on 3 fronts to eliminate the enemy and prevent the army of the Ukrainian National Republic forming up with the Galatian Army and the Entente troops that had landed at Odessa while World War I was still in progress. The Red Army was victorious in the first months of the campaign, entering the city of Kyiv on February 5, 1919. After the loss of the capital, the head of the Directory was replaced with Simon Petliura, an experienced and prominent leader of the Ukrainian national movement. Under his leadership, the army of the UNR launched a counteroffensive in March 1919.
You seeing this guy? This guy right here. That's all bloody. He's using the oh, does he not have a bayonet? It didn't look like it. Watch him taking on 1, 2, 3, 4 Bolsheviks.
Under his leadership, the army of the UNR launched a counteroffensive in March 1919, pushing the Red Army units back almost to
unstoppable.
Kyiv. During the spring and summer of 1919, the Ukrainians and Russians fought vigorously in eastern Ukraine, while the Galatian Army was fighting the invading Polish army in the west.
Swinging that thing.
2 allied armies, the army of the UNR and the Galatian Army, joined forces in 1919, forming a combined Ukrainian force of nearly 85,000 regulars and 15,000 partisans. This mighty force was able to deal with the Red Army units and even entered Kyiv on August 31st. In the country's capital, the joint Ukrainian army confronted the Volunteer Army of the Whites, which led to the UNR declaring war on them. The autumn of 1919 was not good for the Ukrainians, though, as the situation was aggravated by an outbreak of typhus, which by October 1919 had decimated both the army of the UNR and...
Gotta remind everybody, man, in wars, people often die more from disease, okay, than anything. Happened in World War I. Happening here.
The Galatian Army. The 2 allied armies began to split on the question of their relationship with the White Movement. The Galatians signed a separate peace treaty with them on November 6, 1919, leaving the army of the UNR to fight against the Red Army, the Poles, and the White Movement by themselves.
It's like, yeah, now it's like, who do you support? The White Army, the monarchists? It's like you just defeated one of the many factions out there that have their eyes on you.
Against the Red Army, the Poles, and the White Movement by themselves. In the given circumstances, starting from December 4th, 1919, the army of the UNR decided to abandon their regular military operations and switch to irregular warfare instead. During the first winter campaign from December 6, 1919 to May 6, 1920, the Ukrainian irregulars fought the Soviet 14th Army units over the entire territory of Ukraine. The irregulars marched for more than 2,500 kilometers during the campaign and fought in more than 50 battles. On April 22, 1920, the UNR government signed a Warsaw Treaty with the Poles, recognizing their claim to areas of western Ukraine in return for military assistance in the war against Soviet Russia.
Borders, man.
On April 25th, the Polish army, assisted by soldiers of the UNR army, launched an offensive on Kyiv. The city was liberated on May 7th, but only for a short time. The Red Army counteroffensive pushed the Poles and Ukrainians all the way back to Warsaw. In the ensuing months, the destiny of Ukraine depended on the outcome of the Polish-Soviet War. Finally, exhausted by the costs of war, the two sides signed the Peace of Riga Treaty on March 18, 1921. A border between the two countries was established, with western Ukraine going to Poland. The eastern part of the country became the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic. The remnants of the UNR army continued to fight the Soviets. Their plan to launch an all-out attack against Soviet troops in Ukraine were interrupted by the Red Army offensive on November 10th. After 11 days of bitter fighting, the Ukrainians were pushed back into Polish-controlled Galicia. Over there, soldiers of the UNR army were disarmed and put into internment camps. The second winter campaign in November 1921 was the last attempt for the Ukrainians to continue their fight against the Soviets. 3 groups of volunteers from the interned soldiers were organized to enter Ukraine to inflict irregular warfare against the Soviets.
You know the ending of the story.
They were poorly armed and equipped, but eager to fight, and morale was high.
Mongols?
Their effort was futile, though. In the Battle of Malimanka, the Soviets crushed the last of the Ukrainian forces when the Bolshevik cavalry intercepted them, and 443 Ukrainian soldiers were captured, of which 359 of them were executed. The second winter campaign was the last military operation conducted by the Ukrainian National Republic in their war against the Soviets that had lasted for more than 4 years. The Soviets ultimately won the war and formed the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic.
Okay, so you had the treaty, right, that ended the war against Germany. And, Ukraine obviously went through all that. And then you add 4 years of that, basically added onto it. Like their whole conflict here was a good decade for the Ukrainians.
Republic.
And then it's
on December 28, 1922, the Republic became one of the founding members of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics.
Okay. All right. Stay tuned. Got a few more comments for you and a few questions for you. Don't go anywhere. All right, so again, Simple History doing a great job, provided a lot of depth in that. I learned a ton about this conflict, specifically with Russia and Ukraine at this time from this video. But let's circle back to kind of what we were doing in the first place. We're trying to use historical context to explain, to predict current events, right? It's one of the great things about learning history. So my question to you, and I want to see you in the comments, okay, is what can we learn about past events between Russia and Ukraine? What can we take from that to analyze the current situation? All right. So specifically what we can kind of start off with is what are similarities and what are differences? Okay. And so, yeah, think about that. And based off this information also, let's think like scientists. This is the data out here. Can we make a hypothesis here? What is the future of this conflict? It doesn't necessarily mean it's 100%, right? That you can't just, history is going to explain the future 100% with 100% in accuracy, because that doesn't necessarily happen, but it can be very useful, right? So based off of what we just learned with this specific story, okay, here in like 1920s and stuff, what predictions can we make about the current conflict? I asked you that question earlier about the longer this conflict goes, because we're, a year and a half into it or so for the time of this recording. And with the events that we know going on, what can we use to predict the future? As the war goes on longer, who benefits more from that? What can history tell us about what we think the outcome could be of this? So I think this could be a spirited conversation to think about. And again, I'm hoping, with these conflicts and stuff going on in the present, we have to use history to be able to make informed decisions about the current and the future. And that goes with everything. All right. With that, we'll see you next time. Bye.